Honorable viewers, I welcome all of you to my YouTube channel, Department of English. Today, I would like to share with you Aristotle Poetics summary. So let's get started. From the Poetics by Aristotle devoted to literary criticism, only the first part, mainly dedicated to the tragedy, was received. Long forgotten by commentators, it nevertheless had a great influence, since Aristotle's Poetics has given birth to three concepts crucial for psychology, social science, and philosophy of art: mimesis, catharsis, and unity of action. Let's see contents. At first, I'm going to discuss executive summary of Poetics by Aristotle. Then I will discuss summary of Poetics per chapter, and then finally I will discuss short summary to this topic. The concept of mimesis which refers to the ability that man to imitate what is other than himself and get pleasure. Chapter 1 to 4. The concept of catharsis, which refers to a hypothetical process by which we would be purged of passion that you are represented in the work of art. The concept of unity of action, which will open up in the classical theorist, including a Boileau in his Poetics. It can also be found in chapters 20 to 21, the first outlines of a linguistic reflection. Poetics here refers to the idea of manufacturing, development, poesis of poeny. Aristotle attempts to define in this book all the compositional rules, thematic and discursive, presiding over the merits of literary texts. The literature is thus indexed to the order of purely human achievement. It is thus, in the language of Marxism, a superstructure as it is superimposed to the real. In no case means a poetic sense of the word poetic, derived from the term poetry, genre, not literary mode of production. Therefore, a poetic art means a work that describes how to write and create works. Not just poetic works in this case, the lyric is excluded from Aristotle's Poetics. Summary of Poetics per chapter. Very short summary. Chapter 1. Aristotle defined the purpose of poetry is imitation, that means mimesis. Chapter 2. The purpose of this imitation is the painting of humanity in good and evil. The paint will cover the good people of merit, the virtues of superior men. Its kind is the tragedy. Painting mistreated poor people and their vices. Its kind is the laughable and the ugly, the comedy. Chapter 3. Aristotle says that there are two ways of telling. Number one, you can imitate by telling, like avoid the mouth of another. As Homer, extraordinary narrator, we keep her personality, intrigatic narrator, story. Number two, you can imitate all the characters with all the characters as acting as an act. Theater. Chapter 4. The poetry as the literary production is a procedure based on imitation and differentiates human and animals. Chapter 5. Aristotle described the epic tragedy and comic, not our actual lyric. The epic is a story, he said, quote, not imitated in time, while the tragedy should last as long as. a revolution of the sun, or one day. Chapter 6. The tragedy is precisely defined as the imitation of an action of high character and complete at certain extent. In a language, a statement seasoning of a particular species according to the various parties. Imitation that is made by characters in action, not a story, and arousing pity and fear. Operators, purgation, that means catharsis, is specific to such emotions. This imitation of the action is history, arrangement of the facts, of the characters, what is said of the characters in action. This concept goes, goes with a deliberate and the passage of character, then condition. The character is defined in chapter XB. So let's next see. Chapter 7. The story, methods, the myth, the story must be ordered. Tragedy is an imitation of an action, mimesis praxis, brought to an end and must be fully complete with. It should be a good start, a good note, a good end. Chapter 8. Aristotle calls a unity or unit of imitation. The story is a completely unchangeable. That is what we would call today the global economy of history. Chapter 9. The historian is opposed to the poet referring to any writer. The historian tells recent events and the individual is interested as well. The poet evokes what could happen and does the general. Chapter 10. The single action does not include recognition or opposite. Complex action. Complex action combines these two processes, recognition and episode, are further defined and chapter next. Tragedy is the based on with a complex action. Chapter 13. Chapter 11. Aristotle then defines the two sentiments conveyed by the tragedy, pity and terror. These feelings can for purification or catharsis to identify with characters out of himself by releasing the emotional responses suggested by the performance. Aristotle also details the following concepts. Episode: the reversal of the action in the opposite direction, depending on what was said. Recognition: so dear to the theatre, derivation passes from ignorance to knowledge. All errors are described in chapter XVR. Event: pathetic action which causes distraction or suffering, injury or agony. Chapter 12. This chapter explains the parts of tragedy. Prologue, episode, Exodus. Chapter 13. Aristotle describes the pitfalls to avoid in the composition of the stories. Just a man to must not slide freely in misfortune. An evil man does not know the happens, etc. Number 14. This chapter is about the arrangement of situations, today called the knotting of the situation. The arrangement of situations carries the unity of imitation discussed in chapter BWR. Chapter 15. List the 4 criteria required of a character. Number 1, goodness in the actions and words. Number 2, the adequacy of the character represented the character. A woman is feminine, a mainly man. This criterion is behavioral. Number 3, the similarity of the character and model appearance. Number 4, the consistency of character imitated in the unfolding of the tragedy. Number 16, chapter 16. Aristotle lists 4 types of recognition. Number 1, by external signs. Number 2, by the will of the poet, prophetic arts of choice. Number 3, by the memory of the character or the public. Number 4, by detecting the public. Number 17 chapter. According to Aristotle, the situation should be as present as possible under the eyes and gestures to accompany the words. Chapter 18. Two concepts are developed. Note, the beginning until the last moment which carries are turned around. The outcome, the beginning of the shift until the end of happy or unhappy. Chapter 19. Here Aristotle refuses to be interested in thought and speech as his treatise is rather poetical style. Chapter 20. The considerations of this chapter refer to the pronunciation and the sound value of the signifier in the discourse of the characters. Chapter 21. This chapter is a small onomastic treatise where there are a few elements in the rhetoric the same author, including the analogy and the metaphor. Chapter 22. This chapter discusses the appropriateness of common names and vocabulary in the tragedy. Chapter 23. Aristotle returns to the epic who must obey the same rules of composition the tragedy by departing from in though imitate the action is longer, but not like a historical narrative. The epic, now chapter 24, the epic must contain the same characters and the same species as tragedy, simple and complex as described in chapter X. The poet must be silent because the presence in the text of his personality can affect imitation. The epic points out to the irrational in his story, and this must more than the tragic poet. 25 chapter. This chapter is the probable. Aristotle analyzes the patterns of acceptability of the shares represented in the epic. Some things exist or have existed, and then things are allegedly existing at last, things that should be. By playing these modes, the poet can avoid criticism. Similarly, it can find an interest and serving his purpose. He will use metaphors, the words evil, appropriate, and possible contradictions in its story. Chapter 26, and this is the last chapter. To Aristotle, tragedy is superior to epic. Let's discuss about summary. Short summary. Aristotle's Poetics is considered to be the first known work focusing on dramatic theory and literary theory. There is some question as to whether the material actually focuses directly enough on literary theory, with detractors citing that no poems exist within the pieces. It is viewed by some as being concerned largely with dramatic musical theory, which contains elements that go beyond language. In poetics, the use of the term poetry refers not only to the traditions of lyric and epic poetry, but from its Greek definition, meaning making, is meant to include genres encompassed by drama such as comedy, tragedy, and body star plays. Aristotle's poetics was virtually lost to the Western world for a long period of time, becoming available in the Middle Ages and the first years of the Renaissance via a Latin translation from the Arabic. Aristotle structured his examination of poetry by systematically considering what he found to be the parts of which it consisted and trying to formulate generalizations. The section of the treatise in which Aristotle dealt with comedy is lost, leaving tragedy and epic poetry as the primary genres. His definition of poetry includes the following characters: imitative, mimetic, language along with rhythm and harmony which can appear separately or together. The imitative aspect is to suggest that poetry is symbolic of events and or of objects in the world. To Aristotle, this definition or differentiates poetry from other discourses such as philosophy, where representing ideas is the objective. He believes this representation of things serves to teach by providing the means to study disturbing objects without having to make a direct observations. Poetry is a strong learning device in that humans have an innate inclination towards imitation. Aristotle's definitions of comedy and tragedy have become staples in the literary world. He calls tragedy the highest level of poetry as it deals with the matters of great import. Comedy, conversely, focuses on matters of a baser nature. He points to the hymns to the god dances sung by sawyers, with at times a narrator as the roots of tragedy. Scholars then extended the form by having an additional voice engage in dialogue with the narrator. When Sophocles then added yet another actor, the form of tragedy as known to the modern world was born. Aristotle formalizes his definition of tragedy by refining and adding to his definition of poetry. Seven characteristics emerge as a definition of tragedy. Tragedy is imitative. It is serious. It tells a developed story as opposed to a simple anecdote, and it contains some semblance of rhythm and harmony. Related but considered a separate characteristic is that rhythm and harmony occur in different combinations in various parts of the work. Rounding out the characteristics is that tragedies are meant to be performed rather than narrated, and they elicit strong feelings in people such as fear and pity, which the tragedy helps them deal with by serving as a catharsis. Further, breaking down the structure of tragedy, Aristotle cites the six important parts of tragedy: plot, character, thought, diction, melody, and spectacle. The plot needs to have a starting point that is followed by a middle and ending, both of which follow in logical order with the ending dependent on no further events. Everything in the plot must serve a purpose and nothing should be left unresolved. He believes unity among all of the events in the plot support the ability to present universal truths in the most effective way. He adds that this makes tragedy stronger than history because history is tied into specific events. Aristotle shouns episodic plots for not requiring a sequence of events, but plot twists are valuable when they stem from reversal reversals of fortune or through discoveries that are made by characters. A good plot is unfolded slowly and logically. In order to develop feelings of pity or fear in an audience, a tragedy must have a hero who errs and falls from happiness to a state of unhappiness. Common methods of trying to create these feelings can involve having a member of a family harm another member of his own family. This is more effective than if the harmed party is a stranger or even an enemy. The hero needs to possess good character traits and should seem realistic and consistent of nature. Plots to Aristotle must be consistent like the characters, and so must unfold and be resolved logically, not by some omnipotent act at the end. After some attention to thought and diction, Aristotle discusses the epic poem. Although having certain similarities to tragedy, such as the topics that provide the storyline, and the need for plot unity, there are significant differences as well. Epic poetry is generally longer than tragedy and so can cover a longer time frame and be more sweeping is in scope. The same differences are supported by the epic from being created to be read rather than performed. Tragedy, on the other hand, can make use of music and spectacle on the stage. And those devices can appeal to additional senses. After comparing tragedy and epic poetry, Aristotle reaches the conclusion that tragedy is the superior form. So that's all about today's topic for Aristotle Poetics. For the time being, thanks for patience sharing. Bye bye.